Hi and welcome back to the Wine School, and this week we are travelling from Australia to New Zealand. Now New Zealand is often seen as an add-on to Australia, and geographically it does follow that we come to it next, but the wines are stylistically quite different. A New Zealand wine website a while ago actually referred to Australia as a large arid island off New Zealand's northwest coast, which shows just there's a bit of rivalry there as well, but the wines are really quite different. In terms of worldwide production, New Zealand's only 1% of the total, but in the UK market it's actually huge. At one point not that long ago, 1 in 10 bottles sold in UK supermarkets was a Kiwi Sauvignon, which is huge considering it's come from virtually nothing 20 years before that. The first region we come to, at the north end of the South Island, is the pretty little town of Nelson. Now this gives its name to the whole region, and it was traditionally a fruit growing region. It has some of the highest levels of sunshine in the whole country, even though it's a little bit further south and therefore cooler. It's now predominantly planted with Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir, and they give some really good fruity examples of these wines. Sometimes among the best in the country, particularly some producers of Chardonnay, but generally it's eclipsed by some of the larger regions. If you do a few hours drive through the Marlborough Hills, quite windy roads, you come to the Blenheim and the Marlborough region, which is the biggest in New Zealand. It accounts for about 60% of the production in New Zealand, which is vast when you consider how many different regions there are. Up until the 1980s, there were virtually no vines planted in Marlborough, but it soon became clear with the first sort of bottlings from the early 80s just how distinctively grassy and herbaceous this style of Sauvignon was. It was unlike anything, particularly for the ones we're used to in the UK market from the Loire. They're quite dry, quite austere in some instances. If you think of Sancerre and Pouilly-Fumé, great wines in their own right, but they don't have that really punchy, herbaceous acidity that New Zealand Sauvignons have. Part of this is due to the topography of New Zealand. If you think about it, New Zealand should actually be a lot hotter than it is. It's on the same latitude in the south, if you transfer it to the north, as the Douro. And if you think of central Portugal, that is considerably warmer. Even allowing for the effect of the Gulf Stream, it's still a lot warmer than the south. Now this is partly due to New Zealand being so long and thin, and you get all of these westerlies coming off the Pacific going across the country, and the effect of some of the currents that come up from the south and the Antarctic, which cools the island. Now these westerlies do bring in a lot of rain, and this could cause a problem for the vineyards, except most of them are planted on the east, and the whole of New Zealand in the middle is quite mountainous, particularly in the south. There's the Great Dividing Range, or if you're a fan of the Lord of the Rings, the Misty Mountains, which act as a rain shadow in a similar way to the Vosges Mountains in Alsace, and this prevents most of the rain coming across the island, but it does keep it nice and cool. So if you look at the South Island, there's all of these vineyards right down from Marlborough, right down to the south in Otago, that are protected by these mountains. Another aspect that affects the unique nature of these wines can be in the winery. There are certain yeast strains you can use to emphasise these grassy, herbaceous flavours that you get from Sauvignon Blanc, and other things. In Chardonnays you can emphasise some more tropical flavours. You can divert the wine in different ways. If you actually were in a vineyard and you tasted Sauvignon Blanc grape, it doesn't really taste like Sauvignon. Don't do this, by the way, they don't like it. I found out the hard way. Further east on the coast is the sub-region of Awatere Valley, which is, there's less plantings here, but it's more than there used to be, and it's a slightly cooler area, so you're getting a little bit more of that herbaceous character, a little bit less of the sort of gooseberry character, so it's a little bit more, to refer to France again, a bit more like Sancerre in style, a little bit more elegant, you could say. And then further south we've got Kekarengu, which is where our first wine comes from. This is from Astrolabe. The winemaker is Simon Waghorn. He's been around for quite a while, really good producer. Lovely light, sort of lemony, herbaceous fragrance. A little bit of that nettley character coming through. A little bit of sherbet on the finish there. Lovely and light. Again, that sort of nettley, herbaceous gooseberry character coming through. Really lovely, but quite light, not at all what you'd expect from a Marlborough Sauvignon. It doesn't have that real punchy intensity, but it is still recognisably New Zealand in style. Really good seafood wine. You could have this with lobster, prawns, anything like that. It's a superb, elegant wine. Now, just a little side note on a lot of what wine people, wine geeks say about wine. There's a lot of phrases we use that can be seen as being a little bit fanciful, even pretentious. And I do get that, but if you talk about gooseberry, herbaceous, the technical term for this is methoxypyrazines, and to be honest with you, I'd take Catsby on a gooseberry bush as a description over that any day, because it's a bit more relatable, it's a bit more understandable. So if you think some of what I'm saying is nonsense, the technical terms are a little bit more difficult to follow. Heading north, we take a little hop across the Cook Strait to Wairarapa, which is in the south part of the North Island. Now here, Pinot Noir's historically been done very well. It's historically reliably dry, considering you're getting into a slightly warmer area, and the Pinot's in a more recognisably Burgundian style, so a bit more familiar to European palates. Marlborough is the quality sub-region here, and it regularly vies with Central Otago for the Pinot Noir crown. They both make some really good styles, slightly different. Marlborough a bit more savoury and Burgundian, as I said. Central Otago a little bit more fruity, slightly fuller bodied, but we'll come to that later when we head back to the South Island again. There's also a little bit further north the sub-region of Timuna Road, and that's a bit like Marlborough. It produces some really good Pinots, a little bit more up and coming, worth seeking out because they tend not to command quite the same prices. Moving northeast again, we come to Hawkes Bay, one of the earliest wine regions to be planted by the missionaries. So again, there was a lot of these European varieties. A lot of communion wine was planted here in the early days. Most of these vineyards have gone and been supplanted by Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. But the main grape variety that's grown here is Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. And these are made in traditional claret styles and often labelled so in the early days. And this is still the case now. Although Hawkes Bay is trying to ape the Bordeaux model, it's actually slightly cooler than Bordeaux. You get a little bit more sunshine, so you still get the ripeness, but the coolness is there, so you retain that acidity. And there is a small area called the Gimblett Gravels, which is very deep gravel subsoils, very similar to the gravel beds that you find along the west bank of the Gironde in Bordeaux. And naturally, that really suits Cabernet in particular, but also Merlot, which is slightly earlier ripening, which is important here because you do get some late rains, so you need that slightly early ripening Merlot in the blend as well to get the balance right between the two varieties. Gisborne, on the easternmost point of the North Island, is one of the largest regions behind Marlborough, naturally. Some of the production here is owned by large international companies, particularly Pernod Ricard, so it's focused on the international market and slightly larger scale production. Chardonnays in particular is one of the standouts here, with it being a relatively cool area, warmer than further south naturally, and you've also got a little bit of rainfall and cloud cover that tempers the higher temperatures here a little bit. Also from the east you have the sea breezes coming in which temper the temperature also to help prevent that over-ripeness. There can be a little bit too much rain which can cause rot towards the end of the season, and for this reason traditionally Cabernet Sauvignon was planted here. Again, in the early days they're aping those claret styles from the old world that they knew so well. And now you're tending to find more Syrahs planted here. Now Syrah is a better grape for the area because it's got slightly thicker skins, which means it's less prone to rot if you've got that little bit more humidity. But also the bunches are slightly more open. Cabernet and Merlot grapes are quite tightly packed, whereas Syrah, they're a little looser, so you get a little bit more airflow around, which tends to help prevent rot in the grapes. Just above Gisborne, we have Waikato and the Bay of Plenty. Nice area, warm summers, moderate amounts of rain again. It makes some nice, if rarely exceptional wines. Occasionally too humid, and remember we're heading north again, so it's getting a little bit warmer. Even the whites have some more tropical flavours. Again, some good Chardonnay here, but you tend to find a bit more of in these Chardonnays of the tropical flavours like tin pineapple, rather than the more lighter flavours such as green apple that you find from cooler climate Chardonnays. For example, Chablis, if you remember when we looked at that, it has those very green flavours. We head to the sort of most populous area of the island, Auckland. It's again a warmer climate, but there's a little bit more cloud cover here, which tempers the heat, and there's a balance here more towards red varieties. Merlot here is gaining ground over the Cabernet because it flowers and ripens about 2 weeks earlier, which helps with the slightly wetter climate towards the end of the ripening year. In Auckland there's also a lot of heavy clay which Merlot prefers to any other soil. If you think of Pomerol, there's lots of clay there which Merlot really suits. It takes longer to heat up in the spring, but it retains its heat throughout the year and helps the grapes ripen in a different way to gravel soils, for example. There are some excellent wines produced throughout Auckland, but the standout grape for me is Chardonnay, and particularly from Kumeo River. Their entry-level wine is the Kumeo Village Chardonnay. It's 25% old French oak, so you get a minimal amount of oak in here, but just enough to balance the acidity and the body. So we'll try this wine now. It's got a lovely pale lemon colour. Again, very different from those yellow, very oaky Chardonnays you might be more familiar with traditionally in Australia and California. just a hint of sort of burnt match oak character. Very light, but it's definitely there. Lovely Chardonnay smells coming through. Lovely sort of peach blossom. On the palate we have that lovely mineral acidity coming through. The lovely sort of burnt match oak on the finish as well. Really nice and light, not particularly creamy. There's not much here that indicates it's had too much of the malolactic fermentation, which gives that lovely buttery richness to some Chardonnays. This is quite a light and elegant wine. It would be really lovely with any kind of fish dish, something like tuna, even a slightly richer fish like salmon or sole. If this was from Burgundy, I think you'd be paying about £20 a bottle. It's really, really superb and a really good example of what New Zealand can produce. Also worth mentioning while we're in the area is Waiheke Island. Now this produces some excellent Cabernets, Syrahs, Chardonnays, Pinot Gris, but it's really more about wine tourism. It's slightly drier here because most of the rain that falls on the mainland is gone by the time it gets across to Waiheke Island. And it's also more about wine tourism, given that you're close to Auckland, which has about a quarter of New Zealand's population. Heading briefly north, there's the area called Northland, which produces about 0.1% of New Zealand's total wine production. None of it particularly distinguished, so I think we'll head back south to the South Island and the eastern flank of the South Island, Canterbury, which surrounds Christchurch in the middle. In Canterbury, Sauvignon is in fourth place behind Pinot Noir, Chardonnay and Riesling. Just north of Christchurch is the Wairarapa region, which produces some excellent Riesling on clay and loam soils, a bit like some of those we saw in Clare Valley. Here they're made in a noticeably off-dry style, a bit like Alsace, which has a very similar climate and topography. And we're also seeing a lot more Gewürztraminer across New Zealand as a whole. These aromatic varieties are gaining ground, but I think in this area, and particularly Wairarapa, they're producing some really good examples. In the south central part of the South Island is Otago, and most notably Central Otago, which is one of the world's most southerly wine regions, and it favours red wine production unusually, considering it should be quite cool down here. Central Otago has a natural amphitheatre, which helps protect it from the worst of the weather. Also, it is, unlike most of New Zealand, which has a maritime climate, this has a continental climate, because it's right in the middle of the island. This means it has warm summers and really quite cold winters. Sadly, this is also where we have a big gap in our ozone layer, so it only benefits the grapes because you have lots of really strong sunshine during the day and really cool nights, which, as we've mentioned before, retains that acidity, but you're getting lovely ripeness to the grapes. The Pinot Noirs here do have a sort of richness that you don't find anywhere else. They can be relatively high in alcohol. In this case, the one we're coming to next, 14%, which is quite high for Pinot Noir, but because it has the balancing acidity, it doesn't stand out. You don't get that heat from the alcohol that you can do if the alcohol's out of balance with the rest of the wine. This does mean that the wines generally have quite a lot of elegance and structure. Some of the best vineyards are in the Cromwell Basin, which is the natural amphitheatre around Lake Dunstan, and the Bannockburn region is where we find two of the best producers, Felton Road and Mount Difficulty. So we'll come to this wine next. Now this is relatively light in colour, but not so much so for a Pinot Noir. There's a reasonable amount of depth there. First thing you can smell is that lovely sort of ripe cherry, raspberry fruit, which is typical of Pinot Noir. A lot of richness of fruit there. It really fills the mouth, which isn't always the case with Pinot, except from the best sites. Lovely depth of fruit, purity of fruit. There's no jamminess there, even though this has had lots of sunshine. It's got a lovely purity and lightness. A little bit of rose petal on the finish as well, which I find gives the wine a real elegance. It's a fantastic food wine. You could have this with poultry, duck, any kind of game that you'd find in the UK, like guinea fowl, pheasants, it would be superb with. Now these wines are still relatively small scale production. I actually went to this area several years ago and visiting Felton Road. I was after some particular bottlings of theirs from the previous vintage, and they'd run out. They literally sold everything they had, but they told me that if I was back in the UK I could pick some up from their representative in the UK, which was in Earlsfield, 3 miles from my house, which made me wonder why I travelled all the way around the world to visit the winery, but it's superb place to visit, fantastic restaurants and food, and it's well worth the trip. And it just goes to show that what a good choice of wines we have in the UK market compared to other parts of the world. I hope you've enjoyed today's little talk, and join me next time when we're moving across and staying in the New World, or arguably the Old World, in South Africa.